Hello and welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where two friends get together and talk about the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and joining me today for season 2, making her season 2 debut, Cecilia Betzel. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
It's been a little while. Last time you were on here, we talked about Countess Elizabeth Bathory and also Eileen Wuornos at the very beginning of the show. So today we're talking about Gilles De Rais, who has sort of a similar murky truthism to his story. So what made you interested in this specific case?
I like historical murders, I think, and he's one of the alleged, technically one of the first serial killers. First one to be prosecuted for being a serial killer. And I mean, I love this time period. I think it's so fascinating that there's so much, like we were talking about, things like prophecies and witchcraft and all that's just accepted.
Right.
So it's really fascinating to see that being applied in law and in their trials.
And what I was thinking about too is, Game of Thrones is such a huge show right now. And then when you go back to history like 1300s, 1400s, there weren't dragons that we know of, but there was a lot of Game of Thrones shit going down.
There might as well have been dragons.
Yeah, I mean, there was.
He was like, there's demons summoning.
Alchemy, Satanism, there was a lot, witchcraft.
It's pretty cool.
So let's just jump into it. We're gonna have to do a little bit of a brief history lesson. And look, we could do an entire episode on the 100 Years' War, but this is my Cliff Notes version. Feel free to jump in, Cecilia, because our story takes place in like the 1430s. But before that, there was this thing called the 100 Years' War, which took place between France and England. And essentially, it was just a dispute over the crown. England super wanted to own France, and France was like, not so much. It was incredibly brutal. It wasn't like they were in battle all the time, but there were a lot of little battles. There was murder. There were kings that died prematurely that totally threw this into question. They had to stop fighting for the plague, just to give you an idea of what was going on in this time. I mean, death was just sort of par for the course. And this was a time of incredible upheaval where the way that the world was run was just by monarchs and people in incredible positions of power saying that they wanted more of that, and those that were subordinate to them just being bottom feeders and just getting the bad end of the deal here. Now what happens is that there's the Siege of Orleans, which is where Joan of Arc enters into the history books. She was a 17-year-old girl who was a virgin, and they made a huge—
Allegedly.
Well, they made a huge deal of her virginity, that she was gonna save the city and also was super a virgin. Whenever I've done my research on this, it's such a big deal that a virgin would save the city. Like, God forbid she had sex
do we
once.
know where the prophecy came from?
So we do, and we're gonna put a pop-up right now that's gonna say that, but off the top of my head, we don't. But basically, what happened was the English forces were surrounding the city of Orleans, and
Which is how we've decided to pronounce it.
Yes, because the French won the battle, so we're gonna pronounce it Orleans. We're not gonna say Orleans. Yes. So the English were surrounding this city, which was the city that was about the same size of London at the time of the siege, and they were sort of strangling them and just hoping that they would give way. But within 9 days, Joan of Arc led the comeback. I sort of described it to Amir as like the Super Bowl of war, where the underdogs won, I suppose.
She just came out of nowhere. She was like, hey, Charles, give me an army and I'm gonna take back your city. Because it seemed like everyone had just sort of accepted that Orleans was gone.
She comes in and she was like, yo, I'm 17, I can't read, I'm from the east side of France, and I'm gonna free this city, motherfucker. And she did, that's absolutely what she did. And alongside her was a gentleman, a knight, a French knight by the name of Gilles De Rais, who is the subject of our story today. And while he was a celebrated French nobility at that time, he would later be put to death and convicted of murdering over 100 children. And I know we're kind of skipping ahead, so let's go back to the origins of Gilles' life with an element right now.
Gilles de Rais was born into an affluent family of lords and barons in 1405 in the Loire region of northwest France. When his parents died in 1415, his grandfather took it upon himself to ensure that Gilles would marry up. This included creepy schemes to pair a 12-year-old Gilles with a 4-year-old girl who was heiress to one of the richest families in the Brittany region of France. Despite his tumultuous childhood, Gilles grew up to be quite intelligent. He became fluent in Latin and at the age of 16 secured the release of a French duke, which earned him accolades and land grants. Gilles spent the rest of the 1420s alongside French nobility, as well as fighting in the 100 Years' War. In fact, he fought alongside Joan of Arc at the Siege of Orleans in 1429 and was awarded the title of Marshal of France for bravery during the battle. In the early 1430s, De Rais retired from his military career to use his wealth to stage a lavish theatrical production of the Siege of Orleans. He was so much of a spendthrift that family members made direct appeals to the King of France and even to the Pope. Finally, in 1435, De Rais had his assets frozen by King Charles VII. 5 years later, De Rais would be convicted and executed for the murders of hundreds of children. What happened behind those heavy castle doors, and why do so many people believe De Rais is innocent of all charges? Today on Murder with Friends.
So, Cecilia, now that we have given a little bit of background on who this character was, I'm not sure if many of you had heard of him before. What's something from his upbringing that stuck out to you as significant from the time, like, oh, that's just what they did in the 1400s, or something that maybe was an indicator that he would have this dark twist of fate later in life?
I mean, I think obviously being orphaned at such a young age is going to have some effect on you. Mm-hmm. Clearly, his grandfather seems like a pretty tough guy. He was trying to get him married off very young, and I guess you could say wanted just the best for them and wanted them to be wealthy, but it kind of sounds like he would probably benefit from it also.
Right.
And so then at such a young age to feel, I can imagine that you want to just prove yourself and to your dead parents, to your grandfather. Mm-hmm. So to go out and just immediately at such a young age, which obviously was normal at the time, but still 16 years old on the battlefield.
And also, what I think of is how desensitized these people must have been just being raised in war, as that's their understanding of incredible violence and just regular death from whether it was like dysentery or infection, the plague, war was just sort of par for the course.
Yeah.
And I think that does condition a mind to be a little off. And especially that he was orphaned at such a young age. There is a lot that comes into play. Now, let's talk a little bit about the impact of the Siege of Orleans. Like, this is something that we're going to get into in part 2, and I can't wait to tell you guys about it because he put on an elaborate play that it's just.
Guy went a little
crazy. Please, I know that I say this every time. Please watch part 2. I know that it always gets the lowest in views of this show, but part 2 is going to be so juicy because this play is weird as shit that he put on. Okay, but why do you think? Let's talk about the impact of the siege. What kind of an impact might this have had on him, fighting alongside Joan of Arc?
I mean, I don't know. He became Joan of Arc's ward. Mm-hmm. So he was sort of her protector. So I think fighting alongside her, he said that. She miraculously was healed from wounds that would have killed a regular man. And so to be beside her and see all this, and then for her to be captured and burnt at the stake, people blame that for his sort of mental unraveling. But yeah. I mean, that must have been pretty tough for him to, he was appointed Marshal of France at 25.
Yeah, that's
so young. And he's, won all these battles and become super rich. Mm-hmm. Got all this land, just killing it.
As I understand, he was one of, if not the most wealthy person in France at this time.
Yeah, his court was more luxurious than the king's.
Yeah. So this was a guy that was living pretty easy, but had seen.
And he's so young still.
Right. And also, let's not forget that Joan of Arc was put to death for, in part, witchcraft. So this was another thing that just was known, that some people are witches and some people can conjure demons, and this is a true thing that affects lives. And that's another thing that he was raised in, as well as having this exorbitant wealth from such a young age and the power that goes along with that, without really displaying the responsibility of this wealth.
You can kind of see how, if you're just on this constant up and then everything just sort of falls apart, even though France did win the war, right?
Yeah, well, and also that you sort of peak. You have the battle, this incredible siege, you win, you go down in the history books, it's
great. The king
great.
is just lavishing gifts on you.
But then it ends, and then you go back to your
And then you go crazy and put on a giant play.
Right.
And waste all your money.
Right. And this is I think a good time to sort of leave it right now. What we're going to be talking about in part 2 and in part 3 is his eccentric behavior and how that led to people accusing him of so many child murders. And then in part 3, we're going to talk about a movement that is actively in place by historians and scholars to exonerate this man. People say that he is innocent of all charges, and we're going to talk about that theory. So stay with us on today's episode of Murder with Friends. We'll see you in part 2.